Alright, this is our first video on our discussion of bacteria. Remember, this is also paired with the chapter on viruses. Make sure you're going over your videos and notes on viruses as well, and not forgetting about what they are. But this is bacteria. The first time bacteria was discovered was in the 1600s by this man here, Antoine von Leeuwenhoek. That's how you say it, Leeuwenhoek. He was a merchant, not really a scientist, that had a hobby with microscopes, and he discovered them by accident, like many scientific discoveries are. Basically, he was just looking at his microscope and was looking around for things to look at, so he scraped some of that gunk off his teeth because it's the 1600s and dental hygiene isn't the most forethought thought in your head. Um, but he did scrape some of that gunk off and looked under it, and he found small tiny organisms. Will be later be called bacteria. And now we find bacteria all over the place. In every possible place you could probably imagine, there's probably bacteria. They can survive in some pretty harsh environments. So let's look at what a common bacteria cell looks like. First off, they are prokaryotes. That means there's no nucleus in their cells here. So we note that your genetic material, or this chromosomes right here, is just kind of floating around inside. But we do have some basic structures that we'll go slightly in depth on right now that most bacteria are going to have. First is going to be a cell wall, very similar to what plant cells have and some protists. Cell wall is going to be kind of a thick, rigid border around your bacteria. It's going to give it a shape, it's going to give it some stability, and it's going to keep it a bit sturdy and provide a little bit of protection for it against the wild world that they live in. Just inside that cell wall, you find a cell membrane. The cell membranes are normally permeable layers, meaning they let different things go in and out of them. So they are a lot weaker than that cell wall, and they don't have that rigidity that the cell wall has as well. But they will have that to let things in and out of the cell when needed. Everything inside has a liquidy substance we call cytoplasm floating around in it. Cytoplasm is mostly made up of water, but it has other chemicals in there as well. But cytoplasm holds all your other stuff inside. So these things are suspended in this cytoplasm. Ribosomes are where proteins are made. So they are these little dots right here. There's a whole bunch of them in there. So anytime our bacteria cell wants to make a protein in any way, it takes its genetic material and moves it over to the ribosomes, and ribosomes do that. And of course, it has its genetic material. That is the chromosome in the picture here. But chromosomes are genetic material. This is its DNA. These are the instructions for, okay, what is this cell supposed to do? What is the bacteria's purpose? That's also the part that gets hijacked when a bacteria decides to land on it. Some bacteria, not all, have what's called a flagellum, and that's this long whip-like structure that they use like a propeller to move. So in cases they need to get out of their environment, they have a means of doing so. Not all bacteria have these. Some only have one, and some have multiple of them. But it is a movement device used for it. So it's this long hair-like whip structure. It's a flagellum. Bacteria come in different shapes as well. In fact, they kind of go with the name that you have. For example, you've probably heard of Streptococcus, which is the bacteria that causes strep throat. That would be a coccus-shaped, or in this case, that's a spherical shaped. So we do look like spherical. We do have rod-shaped and spiral-shaped as well. You do not need to know the fancy words for each of them, but the book does tell you about the 3 different shapes that bacteria come in. Bacteria size is also another thing that we need to look at. Coming off of viruses, viruses are fairly small because, again, they have to be able to land on a cell and hijack it, so they are smaller than cells. Bacteria are normally single-celled organisms. Occasionally you find 2 connected for reproduction, which we'll talk about. in a later video. But they are single-celled organisms, and they are pretty small. So over here would be an example of the size of a eukaryote cell, like the normal red blood cell in your body or something. And you can see it with a light microscope in the higher ends here of the measurements. Bacteria is further down, so it is a lot smaller. The largest bacteria is going to be about the size of a period at the end of a sentence that you write, just to keep in mind sizes. Next is food. Because bacteria are living things, unlike viruses, they do need a source of food. So they must have a source of food, they must have a way to break down this food, and they must have a way to get energy from it. Depending on the type of bacteria you are is going to depend on what you do. So there are autotrophic bacteria. So these bacteria, just like plants and some types of protists, they are going to make their own food from either sunlight or chemical substances in the environment around them. For example, if they're buried deep in a pile of mud, sunlight doesn't quite reach to them, and therefore they can make food based on the chemical substances that are in their environment. Up at the top here, this is the chemical formula for photosynthesis. If you do not already have that memorized or written down, that is definitely going to be reappearing in a lot of other chapters and in even different sections of these videos for this chapter. So make sure you get that down and you understand what's going on here. We do have carbon dioxide, we do have water. Through the process of photosynthesis and using energy from the sun, we produce glucose, which is sugar, and oxygen that animals tend to breathe. Not all of them, but you and I tend to breathe it. Next is heterotrophic bacteria. These are bacteria that need to find sources of food. A lot of times these are going to be the bacteria that have the flagella because they need to be able to move around to find that food source. So different food sources for bacteria include milk, meats, and decaying leaves. I'm sure you're well aware of all the dairy products that bacteria help make. Last section here is respiration. I want to make this clear that we did mention photosynthesis a minute ago. Respiration is simply the reverse of that. Respiration is not breathing. All organisms that are heterotrophs tend to respirate. They need food, which is that sugar, and they need oxygen. This oxygen then, and this food then break down your chemical bonds for it and get energy from it. They expel CO2, carbon dioxide, and water. So respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis.